Medieval peasants survived the coldest winters with nothing but fire and hope. Their story will amaze you. Subscribe to uncover more forgotten stories that history almost buried. The first frost always came quietly. No trumpet of wind, no warning in the sky. Only the soft white breath of dawn settling on the thatch of roofs. By the time the village cock had crowed, the puddles had turned to glass, and the grass, once green and forgiving, now crunched beneath bare feet like shards of sugar. For the peasants of St. Cedric's Hollow, a small village tucked between a dark forest and a sluggish river, winter was not an event. It was a presence, a slow, creeping guest that came to stay for half the year. Inside one of the cottages, smoke curled lazily from the hearth. The air was thick with the smell of burning peat and damp wool. A woman stirred a pot of thin pottage, her sleeves rolled high, her fingers red from cold. She hummed softly, the tune older than memory, something her grandmother had sung, perhaps, in winters long gone. In the corner, a child stirred beneath a rough blanket, the kind made from coarse flax and patched again and again until it had forgotten what color it once was. He didn't rise yet. He knew better. The first one to leave the bed was the first one to meet the cold, and the cold was not kind before the fire was fed. Outside, the village stirred to life in fits and murmurs. A distant bleat from the sheep pen, the groan of a barn door swollen with frost, the low, patient sound of men gathering near the well, breath white in the morning air. They spoke of the signs, always the signs. The berries had ripened too early, the crows had flown west, the river had thinned. These were omens to men who lived by the turning of nature's hand. And though no one would admit it aloud, each of them wondered the same thing. How cruel would this winter be? By midday, the sun set low and pale, like a coin rubbed thin. Bread was baked, dark, coarse loaves from barley and rye. It was not much, but it was warmth. The women shared small talk over the oven's heat, each speaking of the season's chores, mending cloaks, gathering rushes for the floor, sealing cracks with clay. They knew the rule. You prepare when the world still breathes, or you suffer when it sleeps. And so they worked. The men cut wood until their arms ached. The older boys fetched straw from the loft to stuff into bedding. Even the children played their part, gathering kindling or chasing the hens into their roosts before night fell. For night was when the cold showed its teeth. When the sun sank beyond the forest, the village became another world, one of creaking timbers and whispering winds. Candles flickered, the fire dimmed. Somewhere an owl cried, slow, mournful, hollow. In the darkness they huddled. Sometimes 2 or 3 families shared one hearth, pressed shoulder to shoulder, trading warmth the way they traded bread. It was not shameful, it was survival. The cold was an enemy, and against such an enemy there were no walls, only each other. And in that dim glow, before sleep claimed them, stories would drift through the smoke. Stories of winters worse than this, of the time the river froze solid and men walked across it as if it were stone. Of saints who lit their fires with prayer alone. Of wolves that prowled the forest's edge, their eyes burning like lanterns in the snow. And sometimes, between stories, there was silence. A silence so deep it felt like the earth itself was sleeping. Only the fire's quiet sigh reminded them that life, in its small, fragile way, endured. By the second week of frost, the sun no longer lingered. It rose late, if at all, and fled by afternoon, as though weary of shining on such a cold world. The shadows of St. Cedric's Hollow stretched longer each day, until even the children forgot the shape of the fields beneath the snow. The villagers had learned, through centuries of cold, how to live in rhythm with the long night. When the world slept, they too slowed, not in laziness, but in survival. The men repaired tools by the hearth, wooden yokes, broken handles, iron nails rusted by damp. The women spun wool into thread, their fingers deft even in the dimness. A spindle's whir, a crackling fire, that was the sound of winter. And in that rhythm, the peasants found a strange peace. Outside, the world was silent. only the soft patter of snow from the roof or the creak of trees bending beneath its weight. Even the animals grew quiet. The cows stood close together in the byre, their breath steaming in the cold air, eyes half closed as if dreaming of spring pastures. In the cottages, they lived by the fire's moods. When it burned bright, the room filled with laughter, someone telling a foolish tale or teasing a sleepy child. When it burned low, all voices hushed and time stretched. They could almost hear the snow falling, not as sound, but as a feeling, pressing softly against the world. That winter, they said, was colder than most. The river froze before the feast of St. Nicholas. The well, once the heart of the village, was sealed beneath ice so thick it could bear the weight of a man. But cold alone could not frighten them. Hunger, that was the true enemy. Grain was precious and stored carefully in the Lord's granary, guarded by his men. The peasants had little, just sacks of barley, dried peas, and a few onions hanging like ornaments from the rafters. Sometimes a rabbit from the traps, sometimes nothing at all. So they made do, as their fathers had done. They thickened soup with bark and oats. They chewed on hard bread softened in broth. They shared everything, even the little they had, for winter was crueler to the selfish. In the evenings, they told stories not just for comfort, but for courage. Old Martin the shepherd liked to tell of the winter of wolves many years ago, when beasts came down from the forest to raid the livestock. He'd survived, he said, by hanging garlic at his door and burning pine needles in the fire. The children listened wide-eyed, the flames reflected in their faces. No one said aloud that wolves had been seen again, their tracks fresh in the snow. When the moon rose full, silvering the roofs and fields, the hollow seemed otherworldly, too still, too bright. From the forest came sounds they didn't name, branches snapping, something moving heavy and slow between the trees. But within the cottages, people drew close and prayed softly, not for deliverance, but endurance. They were not rich, nor holy, nor learned, but they knew something far older than books could teach: how to wait. They waited for warmth, for bread, for sunrise. They waited for the thaw that always came, though never soon enough. And as they slept, huddled in the smoky dark, the frost crept along the windows, weaving its white lace like the patient hand of winter herself. The fire had burned to embers long before dawn. Only a faint orange pulse glowed beneath the gray ash, like a heartbeat refusing to die. In the cottage of the weaver's family, 3 souls and an old dog named Fen, the cold had crept in again, finding every crack, every nut in the timber, every inch of unguarded skin. The mother, Alice, stirred first. Her breath rose in a mist. For a moment she didn't move. She simply listened. The world, when winter ruled it, was a soundscape of stillness. The faint creak of the rafters, the soft drip of melted frost, the steady breathing of her husband beside her, wrapped in the same coarse blanket. Outside, all was white. The snow had fallen through the night, muffling the earth, covering every trace of yesterday's footprints. Even the path to the well was gone, hidden beneath the silence. Alice rose quietly. She knew how to move without waking anyone. Her life had taught her that. She reached for a small bundle of dry rushes and twigs beside the hearth, arranged them with care, and blew gently into the coals. At first, nothing. Then, with a sigh, a whisper almost, a tiny flame stirred.
The light grew. Fen's ears twitched. Her husband turned in his sleep. Fire was life, more precious than bread, more sacred than wine. To let it die entirely in winter was a sin against sense itself. Every family guarded theirs like a relic, feeding it just enough through the night to coax it back to life by morning. Alice watched the flame bloom, small but steady. Its glow touched the walls, where dried herbs hung like old blessings. Sage for sickness, rosemary for memory, thyme for courage. She smiled faintly. The cottage smelled of earth and smoke, humble scents, but to her they were comfort. As the fire caught, She reached for the iron pot and ladled in what remained of yesterday's meal. Pottage, thin and tired, a stew of barley and roots. A few wilted greens floated near the surface, relics of the autumn garden. Still, it was food. Her son, little Thomas, stirred beneath the blankets. He was 6 winters old enough to know hunger, young enough to dream of summers that never seemed to come. Is it morning?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Not yet," Alice whispered, "but soon." He nodded, burrowing back beneath the covers. Children learned early not to rush the day. The mornings were the hardest hours, when the frost bit deepest and the light was weakest. Her husband, Edric, rose at last. He was a large man worn thin by work, a farmer's back, a blacksmith's hands, a soul too stubborn to bend even to winter. He nodded to her without words, reached for his boots, and began to lace them in the half-dark. "Wood's low," he said quietly. "I'll fetch more when the sun's up." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You'll stay warm. I'll go." There was no argument in his tone, only the dull certainty of habit. She let him go. Outside, the morning was a world of gray. The sky hung low, pressing against the fields. The snow was thick, waist-high in places, and the forest beyond the village seemed half vanished, swallowed by mist. Edric moved slowly, each breath turning to frost in the air. He had walked this path 1,000 times, yet each winter remade it, the world reshaping itself beneath the weight of ice. The forest was both friend and foe. It gave wood for fire, berries for hunger, shelter for beasts, but it also hid danger, wolves, thieves, spirits, they said, though Edric had never seen one. Still, he crossed himself before entering, as all men did. The trees stood silent, their limbs heavy with snow. The only sound was the groan of his axe and the thud of falling wood. He worked until his breath came hard and his arms ached. When he paused, leaning against the haft, he could almost hear the forest breathe, deep, slow, ancient. In moments like that, he felt small. Not in shame, but in awe. The land had seen 1,000 winters before him and would see 1,000 more when his bones had turned to dust. He gathered what he could carry and turned homeward. Behind him, the woods swallowed his footprints almost as quickly as he made them. Back in the village, the snow had stopped, leaving a pale calm behind. Smoke rose from the chimneys like thin prayers. From one cottage drifted the sound of a fiddle, soft, hesitant, but bright as candlelight. It was a rare thing, music in winter. Most instruments lay silent for months, their wood warped by cold, their strings slack with damp. But this morning, young Elswith had played. She was the miller's daughter, her hair the color of straw, her eyes like thawed ice. Her family's mill had long frozen, its wheel locked beneath ice. But she played still, if only to remind the world that it could sing. The tune reached Alice's cottage just as Edric returned, his shoulders white with snow. He set down the wood, nodded toward the sound, and said with a faint smile, "Even the frost can't stop her." Alice smiled back. No frost can stop a heart that remembers spring. They laughed, quietly, but it was laughter nonetheless, and that, in winter, was a kind of rebellion. That night, after supper, a stew thickened with grain and hope, the family gathered close to the hearth. The fire burned strong, golden as sunlight. Alice took a small iron poker and stirred the logs. The sparks leapt up, bright and brief. Thomas clapped, delighted, as though watching stars being born. "Tell me a story," he said. Alice looked at Edric. He nodded, settling back. She began softly, her voice low and rhythmic, the way stories were told before books, before ink, before time itself seemed to move faster than the fire. "There was once a winter," she said, "when the sun forgot the earth. The days were dark, and the nights longer than any man could remember. The people grew cold and afraid, until one woman, a peasant like us, climbed the tallest hill, and lit a fire so bright it reached the sky. And when the sun saw that flame, it remembered the world again. Thomas's eyes shone. Did she freeze? Perhaps, Alice said gently. But because she burned, we are warm. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow fell again, soft, endless, and forgiving. They sat together in its glow, the three of them, their shadows dancing on the walls like memories of those who had survived 100 winters before. And in that warmth, small as it was, they found something holy, not in church bells or sermons, but in the simple defiance of living. The moon rose pale and thin, like a coin hammered flat by hunger itself. It was February now, the season the old folk called the hunger moon, the time when stores ran low, when bellies growled louder than wolves, and when every candle stub was counted before dusk. Inside the weaver's cottage, the air had grown heavy. The smell of smoke and boiled grain clung to everything, their cloaks, their hair, the rough thatch above. Alice still tried to hum while she worked the loom, though the threads tangled often in her stiff fingers. The song was old, a cradle tune from her mother's, but it made Thomas smile, and that was reason enough to keep it alive. Edric spent most days in the forest now. The snow had begun to crust on top, making every step a complaint of ice. He followed rabbit tracks, though he rarely found meat. Once he brought home a single bird, thin as a bone flute. They roasted it whole, then scraped the fat from the pan and saved it in a clay jar, for fat meant warmth as much as food. Each evening they marked a notch on the doorpost, not for the passing of days, but for the surviving of them. The meeting at the hall.
When the stores shrank too low for one house to bear, the villagers met at the Lord's hall. It was not grand, just a wooden hall on a rise above the village. But its fire was large enough that everyone came to feel it at least once a fortnight. The steward, a narrow man with ink on his hands, stood before the peasants and read the Lord's decree. A handful of barley to each household and permission to cut dead wood from the outer forest. No more, no less. There were murmurs, soft, resigned. They had expected nothing better. Still, when the meeting ended, old Martin the shepherd lifted his mug and said, "To spring, whenever she remembers us." A few laughed. Laughter in February was rarer than wine. Bread of ashes. Back home, Alice mixed what barley they had with ground acorns and a little ash from the hearth. The dough smelled bitter, but the fire turned it golden, and the first bite almost tasted like hope. She taught Thomas how to bless the loaf. Touch of thumb, forefinger, middle finger, Father, Son, Spirit, before cutting. He did it solemnly, as though the bread itself might listen. That night, while they ate, the wind rose again. It found the cracks between the logs and sang through them, a high, thin note that never quite ended. Fen the dog whined and pressed close to Thomas's side. "Is it wolves?" he whispered. "Only the wind," said Edric. Then, softer, "and maybe the ghosts of winters past." The candle blessing. On the second Sunday, the priest came riding from the abbey, his cloak shining with frost. "Candlemas," he said, "the day the Virgin blessed the flame that would guard the world until spring." The villagers gathered in the church, each carrying a stub of candles saved from Christmas. The priest lit them all from one flame. The smoke curled upward, pale blue against the cold stone walls. When Alice's turn came, she held her candle carefully, whispering her own prayer. Not for riches, nor even warmth, but for one more sunrise with her family whole. The wax dripped onto her fingers and hardened there like a second skin. That night, back home, she set the blessed candle on the table and let it burn while they slept. Its light was small, yet it pushed the dark back just enough to dream by. The thaw that wasn't. A week later, the air softened. Snow slid from the roofs in heavy sighs. The villagers dared to hope that winter had turned.
Edric took Thomas to the river to test the ice. It cracked and groaned, but did not yet break. Beneath the clear surface, fish drifted slow, half frozen, their silver scales dulled by the chill. "Soon," Edric said, "when you can see the water move again, spring will be near." But that night the cold returned, harder than before. The thaw had been a trick. The frost marched back across the fields, reclaiming every inch it had lost. They woke to find even the candle frozen to the table, its flame dead in a bubble of ice. Endurance. They endured anyway. They mended their clothes with thread pulled from old sacks, patched boots with scraps of hide, boiled bones twice over for broth. They told stories until their voices rasped, and then sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the last log. Sometimes Alice dreamed of green things, of leaves moving, of bees thick in clover. She would wake with tears she couldn't explain. Edric never spoke of dreams. He carried them in his shoulders like weight. Thomas, half asleep, would whisper to the dog, promising that when the sun returned, they would run the whole meadow. The promise was a child, but it was enough. The last night of the hunger moon. On the final night of the long moon, the village gathered again at the hall, not for rations, but for courage. Someone had brewed weak ale from stored honey. Someone else brought a crust of cheese gone sharp with age. They sang, not well, but together. The sound filled the gaps between the boards, the way light fills cracks at dawn. When they returned home, the sky was already changing. Clouds broke apart. A faint wind smelled not of ice, but of mud, of earth waking. Edric lifted his face to it and closed his eyes. "Soon," he said again. This time, the word did not feel like a wish. It felt like truth beginning to remember itself. At first, it came as a whisper. Not the crash of melting snow, nor the rush of river water. Just a change in the sound of the world. The wind lost its teeth. The birds, silent for months, sent out a few cautious notes, as if testing the air for mercy. In the fields around St. Cedric's Hollow, the white began to pull away from the black earth. It happened slowly, like a curtain lifting after a long play. Beneath the snow lay everything winter had hidden: stubble from the last harvest, forgotten tools, the bones of a hare. The land looked older than it had in autumn, as though the cold had aged it. For the villagers, the thaw was both blessing and warning. The hunger might soon ease, yes, but so too came floods, sickness, and mud thick enough to swallow a boot whole. Still, when the first drops began to fall from the eaves, Alice stood in the doorway and smiled. "Listen," she said to Thomas, "the world is dripping itself awake." The breaking of the river. Edric went with the other men to the riverbank. The ice there was dark, veined like marble, moaning as the current pressed beneath it. They carried poles to test the thickness and ropes in case someone went through. When the break came, it startled them. A deep crack, then another, until the whole sheet shuddered. A rush of black water surged free, carrying shards of ice downstream that glittered like knives in the sunlight. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then old Martin laughed, a rough, surprised sound that turned to coughing. "She's moving again," he said. "We'll live." The men went home with wet boots and lighter hearts. Work returns. With the thaw came work. The women swept out cottages, tossing the winter's rushes onto the midden heap. The smell was sharp, stale smoke, damp straw, life resuming. They laid fresh reeds, green and sweet. Edric cleaned the plowshare, oiling it against rust, though the ground was not yet ready. He spoke little. The rhythm of sharpening metal was enough conversation. Thomas ran outside at every chance, his boots sinking deep in mud. He brought home twigs, bright pebbles, anything that wasn't white. "Look," he told his mother, holding up a single green shoot. "It's brave." She nodded. "We must be too."
The fever. Thaw brought more than life. A cough began in one cottage and drifted to another. The air that had been too cold for sickness now carried it easily. The priest walked from house to house with his bundle of herbs, sage, yarrow, and a touch of honey. When Tomas fell ill, Alice sat beside him all night. His skin burned, yet his hands were cold. She sang the same lullaby she had woven through the winters before, her voice a thin thread over the sound of the rain. Edric brewed a potion of bark and ale. It tasted foul, but steadied the boy's breath. 3 days later, the fever broke. Outside, the first crocus pushed through the slush as if answering some silent bargain. The floodplain. By March's end, the river had grown wild. It spilled into the meadows, carrying twigs and straw, flooding the lower barns. The villagers waded thigh-deep to rescue what hay remained. Edric lost a boot in the muck and laughed for the first time in weeks. "It's good to feel something pull against you," he said, "even if it's the earth itself." They built channels with spades, guiding the water away from the cottages. The work was slow, but the air smelled of wet soil, not smoke, and that was worth the blisters. Candlelight and rain. At night, they still gathered by the hearth, though the fire burned smaller now. The warmth of the world was returning. Wood could be saved for the next cold spell. Alice mended clothes by candlelight. Tomas drew in the soot on the hearthstone, trees, birds, a round yellow sun. Edric watched them and said, half to himself, "We've come through another." She looked up from her sewing. "Until the next," he smiled. "There will always be a next. That's how you know you're still alive." The Feast of Mud. When the ground grew firm enough to walking, the villagers held their first gathering in the open air. They called it the Feast of Mud, not a real feast, but a bit of laughter to mark the end of the long dark. Each family brought something, a crust, a dried apple, a jug of weak ale. They sat on logs around a smoky fire, telling stories about the winter as though it were already a distant memory. Children chased one another through puddles. Someone played a pipe, someone else danced. For a few hours, they were not peasants or serfs, but simply people under the same clearing sky. When the sun dipped low, Alice noticed how the light touched everything with gold, the puddles, the smoke, even the scars on Edric's hands. She thought of the stories she had told Tomas months ago, about the woman who lit the fire that woke the sun. Perhaps, she thought, every winter demanded its own small flame. That night, after the village had gone quiet again, she stepped outside once more. The stars were sharp, the air wet and full of promise. From somewhere in the dark, she heard frogs begin their first tentative song. Spring had yet not come fully, but it was on its way, and that was enough.
Alice smiled, kneeling beside him. The chute was fragile, yet it stood upright as though it had been waiting just for him to notice. "Yes, Tomas," she said gently. "Even in the hardest winter, life finds its way." Edric came out next, carrying an armful of kindling for the hearth. He knelt to examine the soil, poking it with a stick. Tiny worms squirmed, the water gleaming on their backs. "The earth remembers us," he murmured. "It is time to return what we can, carefully, and trust it to give back." The fields awaken. Across St. Cedric's Hollow, villagers emerged from their cottages like cautious spirits.
Plows were dragged from barns and repaired. Sheep were led to the slowly greening pastures. Children chased one another, laughing in the mud, their voices carrying over the thawing fields. Alice and Adric began to prepare their small garden plot. They dug the soil with their worn spades, planting seeds they had saved from last summer's harvest: peas, onions, and the last few carrots. Each seed was treated as sacred, a tiny promise that the coming months would be better than the last. At the same time, the women shared herbs and tips, mending clothes while gossiping softly. "The catkins are early," said one. "The bees will come soon if the sun warms enough." Even small details, the smell of earth, the pattern of bird calls, told them that the slow rhythm of life was resuming. The first rain. It rained lightly one morning, the kind of rain that seemed too soft to notice at first. But as it continued, puddles spread across the roads, glinting like mirrors. Fen barked at the splashes, Tomas jumped in them gleefully, and Adric muttered about mud and broken boots. Alice, carrying water for the pot, noticed the water dripping from the eaves, running in little rivulets that shone in the early light. It was no longer a threat. It was nourishment. Every drop was a whisper from spring, telling them to plant, to hope, to plan. New life stirred with the warmth. The chickens began to lay again, their eggs small but steady. The cows, thin from winter, grazed cautiously in patches of green, their breath steaming in the air. Birds built nests in the half-frozen trees, while squirrels began their nervous dance through branches, hoarding what remained of last year's nuts. Adric and Tomas worked together to build a small pen for a few new lambs born in the barn. Tomas pressed his hands to the warm wool of a newborn, feeling its tiny heartbeat. "They survived," he whispered, "just like us." Alice smiled quietly, brushing mud from her skirts. She knew the truth. The village had survived more than frost and hunger. They had survived fear, cold, and waiting. And now, with each green shoot, each lamb, each hum of the thawing river, they could hope again. The market path. The thaw also revealed the roads leading out of the village. Caravans of peasants and traders began moving again, carrying carts of vegetables, wool, and salted fish. The old paths were muddy but usable. Alice watched them from the doorway and realized how small their village had seemed through the winter, isolated, frozen. But now it was part of a larger rhythm, connected to the distant hills and forests. The people of St. Cedric's Hollow exchanged news, shared seed, and bartered carefully, mindful of the lessons of the long winter. Every exchange was cautious, respectful, and grateful. The warmth of spring demanded responsibility, not carelessness. Evening light. As the sun sank behind the forest, the village was golden. The thawed earth reflected the light like a mirror, and smoke from the chimneys mingled with mist rising from the puddles. Alice stirred the evening stew while Tomas played with a small wooden top, spinning it across the floor. Adric sat by the hearth, sharpening a blade and watching the shadows. He did not speak much, but his presence was steady and warm. In the quiet, the family could hear the river moving again, water sliding over ice and stone, carrying away the last traces of winter. That night, as they huddled near the hearth, Alice whispered to Tomas, "The world is awake, and so are we." He nodded, sleepy, and pressed close to the warmth of both his parents. Outside, the stars blinked through clear skies, silent witnesses to the slow, patient triumph of life over cold. By the first full week of spring, the village celebrated with a small festival, long and humble, known only to the locals as the Festival of Green. They danced in the mud, sang songs of surviving the hunger moon, and offered thanks to the earth and the sun. It was a festival not of riches, but of relief and hope. Old Martin, now with his hair flecked with frost, told tales of winters past, teaching the children of courage and endurance. Each family brought something to share, a loaf, a jug of mead, or a handful of seeds to plant. For a few hours, the village was not defined by work or frost, but by community, laughter, and life renewed. The thaw transformed the river into a flowing ribbon of silver. The ice was gone, leaving fish and frogs to return. Adric took Tomas fishing for the first time, showing him how to move quietly, how to feel the rhythm of the water, and patience rewarded the patient. For Alice, the river was also a symbol of rebirth. She washed clothes in its cold current, feeling the mud and ice of winter wash away, imagining the promise of warmer months to come. The villagers repaired small bridges and pathways, ensuring that water would not claim their homes again. Slowly, life returned to normal, or as normal as it ever was in a medieval village. As spring advanced, seedlings sprouted in every garden. Carrots, peas, onions, and herbs broke through dark soil. The village children were given small plots of their own, teaching them the cycle of sowing, tending, and harvesting. The adults worked together, sharing tools, advice, and stories of how each patch of earth might yield the best crop. They had learned from winter that life was precious, fragile, and worth protecting. Even the smallest green shoot was celebrated. Tomas carefully watered his patch each day, whispering encouragement to each tender plant. The nights were no longer bitterly cold. Candles burned steadily, the hearths glowed bright enough that the families could work, eat, and tell stories well into the evening. Alice told Tomas of winters past and of all the small ways people had survived, layering clothing, storing food, lighting candles, and keeping their courage. Each story was a lesson, a lullaby, and a reminder that they could endure any season. Adric sat by the hearth each night, sharpening tools, repairing shoes, and silently teaching resilience. Tomas lay close to him, breathing slowly, hearing the steady rhythm of survival. By late spring, the first bees appeared, moving lazily over early flowers. Birds sang in abundance, the meadows were soft with grass, and the river carried warmth and light across the village. The villagers of St. Cedric's Hollow had survived frost, hunger, flood, and fever. They had endured months of cold and darkness, and now life returned to them slowly, like a soft sunrise. Alice and Adric stood outside their cottage at dusk, holding hands, watching Tomas play with the other children. They had survived the coldest nights and learned that warmth was not just fire, but care, patience, and community. And as the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, spilling golden light across the thawed fields, the village rested, content in the knowledge that they could endure whatever seasons came next.